One mom and dad always read to their newborn. From the time he was born, they read Bible stories. They inculcated this little boy with these wonderful Bible stories. And they're really good ones. There are some Bible stories which shouldn't be read to children, but the good ones. They read these Bible stories, and they read and read. But when he was 5 or 6 years old, they quit reading to the little boy for some reason. They just got busy. They quit reading. And so one day, the little 6-year-old called his older brother into the room. He said, "Would you tell me about God? I forgot." We forget sometimes. The writers of the Hebrew Bible chronicled God's redemptive acts and called from their collective memory to remind them how faithful God had been, where God had brought them, and where God wanted to show, where God wanted to lead them next. Through fire and water to a place of abundance. And there is an abundant place, a spacious place, an oasis waiting for you and for me, if we'll allow God to lead us into that march into the wilderness and follow by faith. And that's the faith part. Remembering God and then living by faith. To experience God and God's grace and God's spaciousness and abundance, we have to walk by faith. Now let me deviate a little bit at this point and talk about the real meaning of faith. Faith, living faith versus belief. And I owe this distinction to Soren Kierkegaard because he really nailed this. You see, belief has to do with dogmas and rituals and creeds and the certainty of knowing. But faith is a journey. Faith is a living, breathing relationship. Belief looks for the answers to the questions, and faith lives the questions. Faith launches us into the unknown. Belief has to do with wanting to arrive at a destination of certainty, and faith has to do with the journey, the voyage, the pilgrimage. Faith is a living, dynamic followership. And early on in the Christian church, the evangelistic question was not, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about Jesus? The evangelistic question was this: will you follow Jesus in the way of self-giving love? So faith in the early church was always a verb, and we made it into a noun. Belief produces believers. But faith produces belovers. I'd rather be a belover than a believer. We are God's beloved. And God should be our beloved. So the life of faith should be not so much about believing God, saying we believe certain propositions about God, but be loving God, following God in the way of self-giving love. Now I have to say, and although I've been a minister all my life and given my best efforts and energy to doing this job in the institutional church, I have to say that organized religion is often better at producing believers than belovers. And in fact, in many cases, the institutional church is an impediment to the life of faith and not an avenue to abundance. Because many times the institutional church, organized religion, pretends to have a monopoly on God's grace. An institutional monopoly on God's grace. You think about all the religious apparatus in church. The priesthood, the Eucharist, and on and on and on. Like they have a corner on dispensing God's grace. And I'm not just talking about Catholicism. Protestantism now is just as guilty. But when we focus on beloving God in that direct, dynamic relationship with the divine, then it's a whole different ballgame. That's what walking by faith means. So walking by faith, remembering God, and then finally the key, the avenue to abundance, loving what is. I referenced the floods in Missouri, and apparently they're still not out of the water. Well, no, they're still not. They're still not out of the woods. But I heard one old fella who refuses to leave his property and be worried about things. He says, "You can't get worried about it. Why? It's just one of them things that's going to happen." I kind of like that bit of homespun wisdom. The fact is, stuff happens. Stuff happens. And I have this little series of readings, and it's really not stuff happens. The noun that's used begins with an S and ends with a T, but I won't use that word this morning, so I'll just substitute the word with stuff. Stuff happens. Stuff happens. And so in Taoism, they would say stuff happens. In Catholicism, they would say, if stuff happens, you deserved it. In Judaism, they would say, why does stuff happen to us? If you're a TV evangelist, you would say, send more stuff. The Hindus would say, this stuff happened before. The Buddhists would say, if stuff happens, it is not really stuff. And finally, the Zen Buddhists would say, what is the sound of stuff happening? Well, what I've come to discover is this. It's not what happens to us that really matters. It's our thoughts about what happens to us. As Shakespeare said, it's not that things are good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Loving what is. Byron Katie said that the only time we really suffer is when we argue with reality. We argue with the way things are. We say to ourselves, I wish things weren't this way. I wish things would have been different. I wish I could have done this. I wish reality wasn't as it is. But when we learn to love reality as it is, when we learn to love what is, we have abundance. We have bliss. As Lao Tzu, the founder of the Taoist way, said, if you look to others for fulfillment, you will never truly be fulfilled. If your happiness depends on money, you will never be happy with yourself. Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize that nothing is lacking, the whole world belongs to you.